Today we are pleased to welcome to the studio John Arvanitis, the Associate Managing Director for Compliance at Kroll. John, welcome to the FCPA blog.
Thanks, Richard. It's a pleasure being here today with you.
Well, thank you. And John, today we're going to talk about a few thought pieces. The first one is your FCPA blog guest post from last fall titled A Compliance Plan for FinCEN's New Customer Due Diligence Rule. So John, for those in legal and compliance who might not be familiar with the rule, maybe a little background and why they might be familiar or why they should be familiar with the rule. And also, John, does this apply for just financial institutions or is it also applicable to financial service companies? I'm thinking mutual funds, hedge funds, etc.
Sure. As part of, Richard, the customer due diligence process, FinCEN is mandating that beneficial ownership information be provided by customers of financial institutions and other elements of the financial industry. Beneficial ownership has two prongs to it, the ownership prong and the control prong. The ownership prong revolves around individuals who have 25% or greater control, direct or indirect. And then the control prong involves individuals who have significant decision-making processes or capability within an organization's individuals such as CEOs, CFOs, chief operating officers.
Sure. And what about the actual entity that this rule applies to? What would be the definition? Is it just banks or is it also other financial institutions?
No, absolutely. It covers financial institutions, banks, credit unions, broker-dealers in securities, mutual funds, hedge funds, and certain aspects of the commodities and futures markets.
So it's sort of a wide band of applicable companies here.
Exactly.
And my understanding, according to your article, is that implementation of this is required by May 11th, 2018. So does that deadline remain in place, and are there any sanctions or extensions if an organization isn't ready?
Sure. The deadline does remain in place, and we're under 30 days today, Richard.
Right.
So it's good timing that we're here today. Again, any regulation that's brought forward by governments, regulators, or entities of the government should be taken seriously from an enforcement perspective and, more importantly, an adherence perspective when it is introduced to the market.
And my understanding is there sort of a public site where entities can go to find out more information?
Absolutely. There's the FinCEN website, and I would highly recommend to the audience that they look at the frequently asked questions that were recently released this week.
Well, thank you very much.
Week.
Appreciate it. And in the post, you talked about the importance of identifying and verifying beneficial owners. And John, that's a great pivot point to the recent Kroll-Ethisphere Anti-Bribery, Corruption, and Benchmarking report. And by the way, this is now the third year that Kroll has joined the FCPA blog and talking about this in the studio. So thank you again.
It's our pleasure, and it's a great partnership that we have with all involved.
Well, terrific. So let's get right to it. This year, more than any other subject, the report noted a substantial rise with respect to the concern with beneficial ownership and ownership structure. This is now the third greatest reason why third parties don't meet an organization's onboarding and compliance standards. But John, it's not like this is a new issue. So why do you see the big change this year?
Well, I think there's two things that we can talk about today, Richard. I think this is a natural evolution from third-party risk. Of course, as your compliance program and you dig deeper into third parties, you naturally would be asking, what about the entity?
Sure.
All right. I think the other aspect that's really important is the globalization of enforcement. We've actually seen over the last 12 to 18 months some really, really significant bribery and corruption cases that have occurred. And as part of that, we've seen that there are shell corporations, holding companies that have layers and layers of names and individuals attached to them, but the question still remains the same. Who really owns and controls those holding companies and shell corporations?
So it's sort of like the Panama Papers meets the FCPA.
I think the Panama Papers were, to use your word, a very, very impactful pivot point to this issue.
Well, what's interesting, though, is that 25% of the respondents on the anti-corruption and benchmarking report said that even with the collection of third-party information that they have in place, that they're still not comfortable that they can assess and mitigate the risk associated with this issue. I mean, John, that seems like a really troubling dynamic, and given, our current regulatory and enforcement environment, I mean, what do you think's going on here?
I think that speaks volumes, that comment and those numbers. But I think really what it dictates to a potential multinational corporation is a need to use capability and resources that can assist them in digging deep into the beneficial ownership of entities that they may be choosing to do business with.
Yeah, but John, in a lot of countries, I mean, national registries are not necessarily reliable. So how does a company mitigate the risks, particularly in those environments where whatever information that they can obtain from such registries is questionable at best?
I think what you have to use is the resources that are out there, using firms and practices that have capabilities to assist you in flushing out the beneficial owners of an entity, as well as you described, the legal documents that may be out there. You consistently have to keep asking the questions of, is this enough? Is this true? Is this accurate? As you move forward in your investigative processes of identifying the beneficial owners.
So it sounds like it's not something where one set of data is going to be enough. It's multiple sets of data and then comparing what you're getting?
Sure. The ability to collect information and analyze information, the ability to understand and conduct conversations with key stakeholders, holding your third party accountable and asking them very poignantly and directly, Richard, who is the owners of the company that you represent. That may entice the individual to give you the names of the individuals. I think when you sit across the table from someone and you look them in the eye and you have a conversation with them, it gives them comfort and gets them to understand that you're very, very passionate and sincere about having ethical conduct and prohibiting bribery and corruption.
So it sounds like at certain sort of high-risk regions, this is not a exercise for compliance light, that it's more, I mean, for due diligence light, you're talking about a much deeper dive into the process here.
Absolutely. You want to look at the different risk factors that are out there. You want to weigh those risk factors, and then you ultimately want to make decisions as a result of that, those factors and the information that's provided to you.
Understood. So for a company that's just now approaching this issue, as you said, it's sort of the evolution of compliance now. Any best practices that you've seen just to get started?
Sure. I think your ability to understand the risk going into a potential relationship is huge. I think your ability to collect information, analyze information is imperative. Think conversing both with your external partners as well as your internal partners within your business in talking about risk and potential risk adds great value as to whether you choose to want to do business with an individual, an entity in a high-risk jurisdiction.
So it sounds like this is an exercise that you want to do well before you're engaging with a potential channel partner, not something that you would want to do just to verify what you think you might already have.
Absolutely. This is a proactive exercise that's done prior to entering into an agreement and working with an individual or an entity. And some of the components of that, process revolve around questionnaires, due diligence, screening for key elements to be able to get you the information that we spoke about.
And what about from a monitoring perspective? Have you seen any best practices there? For a company that's already started this process, how can it be maintained throughout the life of a relationship with a third party or channel partner?
Sure. I think that by monitoring and looking at the levels of risk and bucketing medium and high risk potential third parties, and then collecting refreshed data
Okay.
and analyzing that data again to see if new risk has been identified, that's a very, very good way to be able to track your partner and see if risk has been identified or adverse information has been identified. I think one of the key pieces, Richard, is that due diligence should be a cyclical cycle. Due diligence transitioning into refresh and monitoring, and then the due diligence cycle again.
Do you see that on just an interval basis, or does that get triggered by some external change that you should take a fresh look at your partnerships and your third parties?
I think you can look at it from both ways.
Okay.
I think you can conduct refresh 12 to 18 months after onboarding a third party and their entity, but I think also your risk tolerance comes into play, and then based on the level of risk that's been identified associated with a third party and the entity, that then may escalate your timetables to be able to, continue the screening process and enhance due diligence.
Well, the report also talks about how a lot of trouble was unearthed after the onboarding process, and companies reported in the survey that the initial information that was supplied by the third party was incorrect. So does that sort of further elevate the importance of continuing to monitor that risk?
No question, absolutely. I think that you want to always look and refresh the data with the goal of potentially identifying risk. And there may be instances where there is no risk, but you can't say that we've onboarded them and never conduct monitoring or another degree of due diligence and screening, because you won't meet your regulatory obligation.
Let's talk about the regulatory obligations. I believe the regulators have said that you need to continually monitor risk, but they don't address the specifics of frequency. So any regulatory guidance, or is it just up to the company?
I think, as we talked about, Richard, your risk tolerance and your organization's risk tolerance can dictate timetables. But I think one thing that we see is 12 to 18 months recertification of third parties and their entities. And as risk is identified, you may then choose to want to monitor.
Now, on the FinCEN's side of it, going back to your earlier piece, is that just an initial report that's required from FinCEN, or is there additional monitoring required by them as well?
I think that, like we talked about, any beneficial ownership refresh, for better practical terms, would be highly recommended, because you never know how businesses and individuals can change and what decisions individuals make to want to potentially go down the wrong road. I always used to like to say this, Richard, that businesses aren't bad, it's individuals who make decisions that are bad.
And from the sort of foreign perspective on this, do you see that there's been some better practices among even these high-risk regions, that they are getting more transparent about beneficial ownership and national registries? Is the needle moving on the external side in the right direction?
I think, as we talked about with the globalization of enforcement and operations that have been occurring over the last 12 to 18 months, I think this is a hot button item not only in the United States but throughout the world. People understand that bribery and corruption takes many, many different masks, and at the end of the day, they're holding potentially this requirement in other jurisdictions also to that standard.
Okay, well, that's a bit of good news as the regulatory enforcement waters rise on this issue.
Cooperation amongst regulators is huge in today's compliance and bribery and corruption environment.
Terrific. Well, John, thanks for your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you next year and see what issues are rising again.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Richard.
Take care.